In the second half of the 20th century, Vietnam became the bloody arena where capitalism and communism clashed head-on, turning the Vietnam War into the most devastating conflict the world had seen since the guns fell silent at the end of World War II. Today, we are diving deep into one of the pivotal chapters of the entire Cold War era, a brutal struggle whose course and final outcome reshaped not only Southeast Asia, but sent shockwaves across the globe, influencing everything from superpower relations to the rise of anti-war movements and even modern ideas about proxy conflicts. The Vietnam War dragged on for 2 full decades, from 1955 all the way through 1975, tearing the country apart in a vicious civil war fueled and prolonged by massive outside intervention from the United States on one side and the Soviet Union plus China on the other. All told, the fighting claimed somewhere between 1.5 and 3 million lives, with the overwhelming majority being Vietnamese soldiers and civilians caught in the crossfire, while the United States alone lost more than 58,000 of its own troops and saw over 300,000 wounded. To truly grasp what made this war so unique and so tragic, we have to step back and understand the long, tangled history that led up to it. The roots of the Vietnam War stretch far earlier than 1955. For the first half of the 20th century, Vietnam was a French colony known as French Indochina. And even then, a powerful sense of national identity was growing among the Vietnamese people, sparking widespread anti-colonial resentment. During World War II, the entire region fell under brutal Japanese occupation, and when Japan surrendered in 1945, a power vacuum opened up. In August of that year, a revolution erupted, and leadership passed to the charismatic Ho Chi Minh, who had spent years in exile studying in France, the United States, and the Soviet Union before returning home to champion Vietnamese independence. Under his guidance, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam was proclaimed, but the French refused to accept defeat and launched a full-scale colonial reconquest. By 1949, with the Chinese Civil War ending in a communist victory and the Korean War raging, American policymakers grew terrified of communism spreading like wildfire through the developing world. They embraced the famous domino theory, first articulated by President Eisenhower, which warned that if one Southeast Asian nation fell to communism, its neighbors would topple like dominoes, threatening U.S. access to raw materials and strategic bases. The Truman and Eisenhower administrations therefore began pouring money and weapons into France's failing effort, viewing the Viet Minh guerrillas as Soviet and Chinese puppets, even though until 1950, North Vietnam actually received almost no direct help from either superpower. Despite American financial backing, France suffered defeat after humiliating defeat. Finally, in 1954, both sides sat down and signed the Geneva Accords, which temporarily divided Indochina into 4 independent states: Laos, Cambodia, North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh's communist government, and South Vietnam, which started as a monarchy under Emperor Bao Dai. Neither side recognized the other as legitimate, and the agreement called for nationwide elections in 1956 to reunify the country, but those elections never happened. The South, backed by the United States, feared that free and fair voting would hand victory to the far more popular communists, especially after the North carried out radical land reforms that appealed to poor peasants in the South. By 1955, a referendum in the South abolished the monarchy, ousted Bao Dai, and installed Ngo Dinh Diem as president of the newly declared Republic of Vietnam. That same year marked the official starting point of the Vietnam War. What began as a political standoff quickly spiraled into open armed conflict. The communist-led National Liberation Front, better known to the world as the Viet Cong, launched an insurgency against Diem's increasingly corrupt and repressive regime. The United States responded by sending thousands of military advisors, then tens of thousands, while North Vietnam funneled weapons, troops, and supplies down the legendary Ho Chi Minh Trail, a vast network of jungle paths snaking through supposedly neutral Laos and Cambodia. By 1960, the Viet Cong controlled large rural areas in the south. When Diem was overthrown and assassinated in a U.S.-backed coup in 1963, South Vietnam slid into even greater chaos under a series of squabbling generals. By mid-1964, the Viet Cong effectively controlled 2/3 of the countryside.
To prop up the collapsing Saigon government, Washington seized on the murky Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964, where American destroyers claimed they had been attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in international waters. Later, declassified documents showed the second attack was exaggerated or possibly non-existent, but it gave President Lyndon Johnson the perfect pretext. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, handing Johnson virtually unlimited war powers without a formal declaration of war.
From there, the conflict exploded. The first major phase was an all-out air campaign. In February 1965, the United States launched Operation Flaming Dart, followed in March by the massive Operation Rolling Thunder, the longest sustained bombing campaign in American history. For 3 straight years, American planes pounded North Vietnamese factories, roads, bridges, and even civilian areas, dropping more than 7.5 million tons of bombs across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia in total, more explosive tonnage than the entire United States dropped in all of World War II. When bombing alone failed to break the North's will, the Americans turned to chemical warfare. Under Operation Ranch Hand, they sprayed nearly 20 million gallons of herbicides, including 11 million gallons of the infamous Agent Orange, to strip away jungle cover and destroy food crops. The dioxin-laced chemicals not only devastated forests, but poisoned soil and water for decades, causing birth defects, cancers, and ecological catastrophe that still affects Vietnamese families today. Yet neither bombs nor poison could defeat an enemy that simply melted into underground tunnel networks like the famous Cu Chi tunnels, some of which stretched for hundreds of miles and housed entire hospitals and command centers.
Frustrated, the United States shifted to a ground war of attrition, sending combat troops in large numbers starting in March 1965, when 2 Marine battalions landed at Da Nang to protect an airbase. By the end of that year, 185,000 American soldiers were in country. At the peak in 1968, the number reached 540,000. The first big conventional battle came in August 1965 with Operation Starlight, followed by the brutal November clash in the Ia Drang Valley, the first time U.S. troops fought North Vietnamese regulars in a major set-piece engagement. American commanders adopted search and destroy tactics, using helicopters for lightning raids and body counts as the main measure of success. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong countered with classic guerrilla warfare, striking at night, disappearing into the population, and using the jungle they knew intimately. Meanwhile, the Soviets supplied advanced surface-to-air missiles, MiG fighters, and thousands of military advisors. Estimates put the total Soviet personnel at around 10 to 15,000 over the course of the war, while China sent as many as 320,000 troops, mostly engineers and anti-aircraft crews, who kept supply lines open and shot down hundreds of American planes. Other communist allies pitched in too. North Korea sent pilots, Cuba provided tank instructors, and Eastern Bloc countries shipped weapons and intelligence experts.
The turning point came in early 1968 with the Tet Offensive. On the Lunar New Year, nearly 300,000 communist troops and local supporters launched simultaneous attacks on 43 major South Vietnamese cities, including Saigon itself. Although militarily the communists suffered horrific losses, the psychological shock was enormous. Images of Viet Cong fighters inside the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon flashed across American television screens every night, shattering the illusion that the United States was winning. Legendary CBS anchor Walter Cronkite went on air and declared the war a stalemate, prompting President Johnson to moan that if he had lost Cronkite, he had lost Middle America. Public support collapsed. Johnson chose not to run for re-election, and the new president, Richard Nixon, promised a policy of Vietnamization, handing the fighting back to the South Vietnamese army while gradually pulling out American troops. By the end of 1970, more than 210,000 U.S. soldiers had left, and the South Vietnamese forces swelled to over 1 million men, equipped with American weapons.
Peace talks dragged on in Paris for years. In January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were finally signed. American prisoners were released, U.S. bases were dismantled, and all remaining American combat troops withdrew. The territorial division between North and South remained on paper, but the war was far from over. Without American air power and ground troops, the South Vietnamese army quickly crumbled. Morale collapsed, corruption spread, and desertion soared. In March 1975, the North launched its final all-out offensive. Within 2 months, communist tanks rolled into Saigon. On April 30, 1975, the last American helicopters lifted off the roof of the U.S. Embassy in one of the most iconic and humiliating images of the 20th century, and the red and blue flag of the Viet Cong flew over the presidential palace. The war was over, and Vietnam was unified under communist rule as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam.
The human and economic cost was staggering. Roughly 58,000 Americans died, but the Vietnamese toll was catastrophic. Estimates range from 1.5 to over 3 million dead, with civilians bearing the heaviest burden. The United States spent about $168 billion at the time, which, adjusted for inflation, exceeds $1 trillion in today's money. Beyond the numbers, the war left deep scars that still echo today. In America, it spawned the largest anti-war movement the country had ever seen. Massive marches on the Pentagon, the burning of draft cards, and campus protests that culminated in the 1970 Kent State shootings, where National Guard troops killed 4 students. Young men fled to Canada in the tens of thousands rather than fight. The counterculture exploded with songs like Creedence Clearwater Revival's Fortunate Son and films such as Apocalypse Now and Platoon that captured the war's surreal horror. Returning veterans faced a hostile public, struggled with what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, and many turned to drugs or alcohol. The phrase Vietnam Syndrome entered the political lexicon, making future presidents terrified of getting bogged down in another land war in Asia.
For Vietnam, the damage was even more lasting. 15 million tons of unexploded ordnance still litter the countryside, killing or maiming hundreds of people every year. The dioxin from Agent Orange has caused generational birth defects and cancers that continue to this day. Entire ecosystems were wiped out, rivers poisoned, and farmland ruined. Politically, the communist victory ended French and American influence in the region and proved that a determined guerrilla force could defeat the world's most powerful military. Yet it also showed the limits of superpower proxy wars. The Soviet Union and China poured in billions of dollars and thousands of their own personnel, but in the end, it was the Vietnamese who paid the heaviest price. Historians often call Vietnam the first television war, the first conflict where daily images of death and destruction beamed straight into living rooms, forever changing how the public views military adventures abroad.
In the broader sweep of history, the Vietnam War was a painful lesson in the futility of trying to impose ideology by force. It weakened America's global prestige, strained its alliances, and contributed to the eventual end of the draft. It helped topple 2 presidents and fueled the rise of détente with the Soviet Union and eventual diplomatic opening to China. For Southeast Asia, it triggered further tragedies, including the Khmer Rouge genocide in Cambodia and prolonged fighting in Laos. Yet it also produced a unified Vietnam that decades later has become one of the fastest-growing economies in the region and even normalized relations with its former enemy, the United States, in 1995. Looking back from our vantage point in 2026, the Vietnam War stands as a stark reminder that when superpowers fight their ideological battles on someone else's soil, the real losers are almost always the ordinary people caught in the middle. The villages destroyed, the families shattered, and the generations scarred long after the last helicopter has flown away. The conflict proved once again that no amount of bombs, chemicals, or dollars can conquer the human desire for self-determination, and its echoes still shape how nations think about intervention, insurgency, and the true cost of war. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. What surprised you most about the Vietnam War? Or which part of the story do you want to hear more about next? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.